66% of UK workers actively value inclusion when choosing where to work. Yet for many, it's still a subject that's avoided, often through fear of making mistakes or saying the wrong thing. Intersectionality, trust in leadership, and legislation all have their part to play in a topic that represents a moral argument on the one hand and a fundamental business case on the other. So, how do inclusive environments affect mental health? What types of inclusion data are most likely to shift the thinking of senior leaders? And what are some of the most effective ways for organizations to support the mental health of LGBTQ+ employees when public discourse becomes hostile?
Equity, mental health and performance go together. It's really about how do they fuel one another to drive positive business outcomes, because unless businesses pay attention to the fact that they are working with human beings, not robots, then people are not going to be able to do their best. And we know that where they do their best, businesses thrive.
To help us explore these questions, I'm joined by Simon Blake, OBE and CEO of Stonewall. Founded in 1989, Stonewall has played a defining role in changing the law to improve the lives of LGBTQ+ people. Today, their vision is a world where everyone, everywhere has equal rights. Okay, wonderful. So, Simon, great to see you, and thank you for taking the time to join the Wellbeing Talk podcast. How are you doing?
Good, thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, excellent. So really looking forward to chopping up with yourself. Specifically, we're talking today about why LGBTQ+ inclusion boosts mental health in the workplace. I always like to start these discussions with a bit about the person that's sitting in front of me. And in this case, you describe yourself as a compassionate leader driven by social justice, tackling stigma and eradicating inequality. You've been involved in a range of causes over the years at a senior level in things including, but not limited to, things like bereavement, healthcare, higher education. That's everything from the Headspace app to Mental Health First Aid England, and now, for the last year or so, I believe, the CEO of Stonewall. So the question, after all of that, is what would you say are some of the most significant events during your life that have shaped what is clearly a passion for leadership in this space?
So the first thing that I always say, I guess, is that most of it has been accidental. You know, I was supposed to be an educational psychologist.
Right.
And so I went to university, did psychology, was a kid from Cornwall who didn't really know what on earth was going on. And I had all these amazing experiences. But what I also learned was that the world was much more complex than perhaps my first 18 years had taught me. And so then I fell in love, went to America, it all went wrong. Of course it went wrong. I came back, missed the deadline to become an educational psychologist, and got a job doing sex education for young men in the South Wales valleys. And then through that, I had some amazing opportunities working at the National Children's Bureau, where we did a real focus around inequalities and inclusion. It's where I first came into contact with Stonewall, actually, with the repeal of Section 28, equalising the age of consent. So that would have been 25 plus years ago. Mm-hmm. And then just a career which has created opportunity and really through that a growing sense of the importance of driving for greater equality. The inequalities that exist on a macro and micro level, globally, domestically, within workplaces, in communities, is extraordinary. Mm-hmm. And everybody deserves the opportunity to thrive. Everybody deserves the opportunities to get on, and that sense, I guess, is what drives me. I'm now in the last decade of my career, and I feel even more passionately about it in my 50s than I did in my 20s, because it feels even more important to get to the heart of actually making some progress.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that. So it was a mistake, maybe a bad experience in terms of going to America, missing the deadline, but actually that created some opportunities and it kind of snowballed from there. One thing led to another.
And it was really good fun in America. It just all went wrong.
For a while it lasted. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's about the journey, right?
Exactly. Always.
You mentioned about being in the last decade of your career and the passion being more intense, deeper than ever. And I think that's really interesting because, you're Simon Blake, OBE. That's Order of the British Empire, right?
It is. Yes.
Okay. So you received that award in 2011. So, for a lot of people, that would be the mountaintop. That would be, you know, the pinnacle. That would be right. I've kind of done it. I've achieved everything that I'm going to do almost. Well, at least I imagine anyway. And yet we sit here kind of, you know, needed the best part of 2 decades down the line, and you're talking about, you know, taking things to even bigger heights, and you feel even more driven driven with your mission. And I just wonder, I guess, after all of that, where do you find, I guess, the motivation to keep progressing things, to keep pushing to further heights?
First thing I just want to say is, obviously, as you said, Order of the British Empire, my, you know, every part of my body sort of squeezes, because, yeah, the idea of awards being awarded in the name of empire, you know, is not something which I think is something we can be proud of. And so, as part of a group of people that have been campaigning to try to get that shifted to excellence, so you can keep the E, just put it into excellence. Okay. But yeah, I just say that because I think it's really important.
I was going to say, but it was for, well, no, that is important, but also it was for voluntary. It was for services to voluntary and the children's sector. Right?
Yeah, and I think this is where, you know, lots of people in the charity sector, you know, either have a choice of either you accept it and you say nothing, or you don't accept it. And what we were saying is there has to be a third way, which is when you're working on issues of social justice, you know, that recognition from the institution is important for charities, for those you work with, for the work that you're doing, rather than for individuals. And I think, you know, to your question about, yeah, that pinnacle, in the way that is an award, what it hasn't done is actually created the change that we want to see.
Sure.
And so for me, if I take that right down, you know, I feel passionate about all sorts of injustice, but if you take it to Stonewall now, you know, yes, we equalised the age of consent in 2003. Yes, 2000. Yes, we repealed Section 28 in 2003. But the reality is that lesbian, gay, bi, trans, non-binary people are still being bullied at school, are still being hurt in their communities, are still not able to be themselves in the workplaces. I've been married with my partner 21 years, married for 15 years. We wouldn't walk down the streets in London holding hands on the basis that it doesn't feel safe in lots of different parts of it, and actually what is the risk, you know, doesn't feel worth the reward from it. So until we get to the point, and that's just in the UK, you know, and actually think about, you know, that we're, you know, much further ahead than some people. I was going to talk to one of the human rights defenders in country last week, who just at the last minute said, "I'm not in a safe place. I can't have this conversation." You know, the idea that somebody, because of who they love, you know, lesbian, is not able to have a conversation because they're not in a safe place, you know, is just something which I just do not want to be a reality. And so I suspect, you know, I say I'm in the last decade of my working life. I don't think that will be the last decade of my campaigning life. But a world in which people are not free to be who they are is not a world that I want to leave, having tried really bloody hard to improve it.
Hence, more work to be done. Equality for all, which I believe is the mantra, the vision for Stonewall.
Yeah, it's an equal world for everyone, where everybody feels safe, can prosper, can thrive. You know, that has to be the goal for everyone, right?
Yeah, sure thing. And it's interesting you mentioned about, I guess you described a bit of a conflict in terms of, you know, kind of being nominated for the OBE. And then thinking about actually what that means to you in terms of what it represents, but then actually what it represents to you on an individual level, but then also actually what it represents to the organisation, the cause, the campaigning. I believe Benjamin Zephaniah went through something similar.
Yeah. People have all sorts of different responses to it. You know, I have friends who have refused the award, friends and colleagues. I've got friends and colleagues who've accepted it without a second thought, and then friends and colleagues who've accepted it with a reticence. And latterly, the campaign around Excellence Not Empire has been going since 2020. And lots of people said, I felt able to accept it because I knew that I could join the campaign, because we knew that there was a place for people. So, you know, the world is never black and white, is it? You know, the world is always shades of grey, and it's whether we decide to become polarised and shades of grey, black and white, or whether we operate within those shades of grey and accept that there are lots of different responses.
Yeah, or another way to put it, nature doesn't make things in straight lines.
Perfect.
Yeah. Did you ever have any thoughts of actually declining the award then, just on that note?
I didn't have thought about declining it, I think my mum would have chopped me off at the knees, but also she wasn't a violent woman, but also I was chief exec of Brook at the time, the Young People's Sexual Health Charity.
Sure.
We were campaigning around young people's rights to free confidential sexual health services, on abortion rights, to improving sex education, to ensuring that people with HIV had access to the support that they need. So all sorts of issues which people didn't like talking about. So the idea of actually having that recognition for those issues, so for me it's always, of course, there is a personal recognition within that, but actually it is about the issue, it is about the people that you are working for. And I mean, there's lots of sort of phrases, but one of them around an OBE, of course, is other buggers' efforts, and that sense of collective sort of storytelling and campaigning and change, is the bit which is important. But I think you have to use the opportunities and the platforms that are created, or I believe I have to, and that was definitely that sense of the recognition of this issue is important, and we can talk about that. And as you say, 15 years later, we still haven't got to where we need to be, but one step at a time.
Absolutely. And I just love that as a story. It's about the commitment to the cause, something bigger than yourself, that shared sense of purpose that keeps pushing you, that keeps you driving towards affecting change. I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, I mean, you're a year into this tenure as CEO of Stonewall. The previous 6 years, you were at the helm of Mental Health First Aid England. So what parallels, if any, do you kind of observe between your time here at Stonewall and there at MHFA England in terms of driving cultural change?
Yeah. So lots and lots of similarities is probably the first and most important thing to say. And of course, COVID came right in the middle of my time at MHFA England, which shifted the way that we work, in all sorts of ways. And I will talk very specifically about workplaces, because MHFA England was about improving workplaces, and we have a really important strand of our work which is about workplaces through the Proud Employers programme. And what we know is, of course, that people do not leave their cells, parts of themselves at the door when they go into work. And so, if we are worried about people finding out we're LGBTQ plus, or that we are have a mental health condition, then we're not going to be able to do our best work. We need to feel as though we are seen, valued and heard as people, in order that we can offer ourselves into the system. And what that means in terms of culture change is that workplaces have to really engage with the fact that people are human. And that's why I talked about COVID. It really brought it into sharp relief. There were people that I was managing who had children or had caring responsibilities. My mum got terminal cancer and I went and looked after her during that period. We were all managing different parts of our lives. So the change in culture happened. The task that all of us had is, how do you make that deliberate? How do you name and articulate the culture that you want? How do you ensure that everybody believes that you are wanting to be an inclusive environment, whatever it is that you need to be included for?
Yes.
And I guess for me, that sense is about equity, mental health and performance go together. We often talk about them balancing one another, but actually, if you think about them being a Bunsen burner, you've got equity under well-being being the Bunsen burner, well-being under performance being a Bunsen burner, and then if you could, without catching it in anything alike, you'd have the other going under. It's really about how do they fuel one another to drive positive business outcomes. And of course, there's a human case, and that is about everybody being valued in the workplace. But there's also a really big business case, because unless businesses pay attention to the fact that they are working with human beings, not robots, then people are not going to be able to do their best. And we know that where they do their best, businesses thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. So a few talking points there, actually. The Bunsen burner thing is still Still visualizing that. I love that analogy.
You can see what I did in chemistry GCSE, can't you?
There we go. Yeah. So in terms of the parallels, then I guess to kind of summarize what you're saying is, regardless of the aspect of a person's kind of experience, it was the kind of the fundamentals of it was still about, whether it was MHFA or here at Stonewall, it's about how do we create an environment where people feel safe enough to bring their whole selves to the workplace, and obviously doing that against the backdrop of what was quite a lot of change going on, a lot of disruption during COVID as well.
Yeah, and you talk about safe, and I think it's really important to be explicit about psychological safety.
Sure.
That sense of I as a chief exec can say it's absolutely safe. We welcome everybody here, but if it doesn't feel safe, if you don't feel as though you've got equal access to something because of a disability or because of beliefs or whatever it is, then it is going to be difficult for you to be able to participate fully, because we connect when we feel like we belong.
Yes.
And so for all of this, it's about that sense of belonging. And I think there are particular challenges, because now that there's much more flexibility in working, which on the one hand I completely endorse, on the other, we know that relationships are critical to psychological safety, to feelings of belonging, to being able to perform, to ask for help, to offer help, to create joy in the workplace. So our job isn't to say the only way to do that is X. It's say we know that relationships are important. We know that feelings of belonging are important. How do we make sure that we find ways collaboratively with teams, with our people, in order to be able to make that a reality? And that sense of collaboration, I think, is really at the heart of culture change. If I'm sat there as a member of staff waiting for the chief exec to do something, or waiting for my manager to do something, then I'm going to be waiting a really long time, because they can only do a little bit of it. It's all of our jobs to really make sure that we create that environment and culture for everybody that we want for ourselves.
And of course, that's it's something that I think it's increasingly more important to people in terms of choosing a place to work, in terms of how the company demonstrates that those things kind of interact with each other. It brings me on nicely to a report that I wanted to pick your brains on. It's from the CIPD. It's called Resetting EDI and Reaffirming Inclusion. So it's from May of this year. And the backstory is that it essentially highlights the moral arguments about fairness, equality of opportunity, alongside the fundamental case for organizations to focus on inclusion. And the report comes about as a result of interviews and roundtables with 50 HR leaders and EDI specialists. And several really interesting talking points that came out of it. But the first one was that 66% of UK workers actively value inclusion when choosing where to work. So, and I guess you kind of touched on this already, but just to break it down a little bit further, how do inclusive, or sometimes, or in some cases, uninclusive environments affect mental health?
It's interesting, isn't it? 66% is obviously a big figure, but it's like, what do the other 34% want? Is the other question.
Yeah,
is that my
reverse.
right? Yeah, 34.
Yes.
But I think that's because sometimes inclusion feels like it's about other people, and so what we really want, I think, is everybody wants a great place to work. And of course, what some people who may not want to be a great place to work is it feels like it might take away from them if other people have a great place to work. So I think there's something about inclusion being for everybody.
Sure.
And sometimes that means that we have to do, most of the time it means you have to do different things for different people in order for them to feel included. Workplaces are just microcosms of wider society, so those inequities inevitably exist. But how does inequity or lack of inclusion impact on people's mental health?
Sure.
I guess at its most simple, if you do not feel like it belongs, it's not a nice. If you don't feel like you belong, it's not a nice place to be. That can manifest itself in feeling disconnected, in feeling anxious, in feeling like there will be challenges because all sorts of feelings around isolation or despair or anxiety, which may be low-level issues initially, which can, of course, accumulate and become cumulatively problem, because we know stress is cumulative, and unless it's managed, then it can become really problematic. But at its worst, if you are feeling like you have to be hyper vigilant the whole time, you're hiding parts of yourself, your brain is on high alert.
Yes.
That then becomes a problem very, very quickly. And we need to, really think about the neuropsychology, of this. How do our brains work? And if we're all the time worried about the fact that people don't want us to be there, that we're excluded, that we don't get the same opportunities, it's really problematic.
Yeah, it reminds me, takes me back to Mental Health Awareness Week this year. The theme was community.
Yeah.
And I was doing some work on that. It took me down a path of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You're talking about psychology. I believe it's the third one. It's talking about a sense of belonging, community, connection. But the idea, as you'll be aware with the hierarchy of needs, is that you have to take care of the ones down here before you can go higher up. So things like food and shelter are at the bottom because everybody needs them. The third one was the belonging and the connection, and then you move on to being self-actualized and the rest of it. But like you say, people will be stuck in terms of their development if something as simple, well, maybe in some cases not simple, inclusion isn't recognized and embedded into the culture of the workplace. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And what Mental Health Awareness Week, run by the Mental Health Foundation, does every year, picks something which may not feel like it's the most obvious thing to do with mental health. And of course, what we know is that people often think about mental health. When you say mental health, they think mental illness. What we're talking about here is about building, positive mental health. We've all got brains, we've all got mental health, and that's, a really important part of this. And we know, we spend so much time at work. It needs to be a place where we feel like where we belong, where we're valued.
In your experience, are there any kind of specific workplace policies or behaviours that are particularly unhelpful when it comes to the mental health of LGBTQ plus employees?
So if I can just flip it on its head and think about what's helpful rather than what's unhelpful.
Sure.
So if you think about every single policy, what is in it for LGBTQ plus people? So whether that's your parenting policy, does it address different routes to parenthood and parental leave? If you think about the private healthcare, does it address issues if people need to transition? And how does your workplace accommodate that? What are the particular needs for LGBTQ plus people? And if you think about that in every single policy that you've got, some you don't need to say anything other than all people, but some you might need to say there are some particular issues here which we want to talk about and to know and to understand. Naming homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, lesbophobia in your harassment policy. Thinking about how does this manifest itself in zero tolerance, is really, really important stuff. We know also that affinity groups, network groups can be really important places for people to believe that there are people like them. So you might have an LGBT.
Sorry, is that the same as like an employee resource group?
It is.
Yeah, it's just another name for it.
Just a different name. So
okay.
Employee resource group, affinity group, just a place where people can go, oh, I can breathe here, but also identify if there are things that they need to feed back into the workplace. And it is, yes, they might form, organise the summer party or their engagement with Pride, but also if there are particular policies which could be enhanced or strengthened in order to be explicit that they include people. So that is the sort of basic principle. Look at everything, think about what's in the policies, what's in the protocols, but also your culture. What happens when people are not looking? Are there things which might be difficult or problematic? And then also, you've mentioned intersectionality before. We, for the first time, have got 5 generations in the workplace. So I was on a panel just before Christmas last year, where I was the elder, and there were people from 4 different decades. And what we were saying we wanted or what we expected was quite different, just because of when we grew up and what our expectations were. But thinking about, if I was going to be coming to you, thinking about applying to a job, how would I know that you're an inclusive employer? We work, as part of our workplace inclusion program around ensuring that people are signalling to somebody who's thinking about coming to work there, either as someone who's from the community or an ally, this is going to be a great place for you to work. And then thinking about how do you make sure that that then falls all the way through the employee life cycle.
Understood. So a few things there. So visibility in terms of initiatives, specificity in terms of actually naming things like trans, bi, or homophobia in harassment policies, connection in terms of the employee resource groups. Okay. Yes. And ultimately just thinking about actually, instead of flipping it on its head as you did so well just there, actually not in terms of what's unhelpful for people, but actually what would help these individuals very specifically.
Yeah, and I also think we mustn't underestimate that what's going on in the world creates a context in which how people experience real life.
Sure.
And work life. So what's going on out in the world, and we know, that there is, a climate in which trans people in particular are feeling concerned at the moment, but also then wider LGBT friends, family, allies, straight people are also concerned about what's going on more broadly in hate crime, in homophobia, etc. It feels like we're in a more polarized context. So how do you communicate to people who've got that as the backdrop, that actually at work we want to try to be different and better? And I had a friend, a colleague, who's, I guess, is a friend now. We don't work in the same organisation. Amma, who would say, workplace stress in the workplace isn't always about work.
Sure.
And she was talking very specifically in relation to Black Lives Matter movement, and after the killing of George Floyd, about the fact that that sense, if you were black or a person of colour coming into work, actually, it may not be the thing that you're talking about when you're the manager that causes a response, but you need to know and understand the context that people are living and working in order to understand why you might be getting responses which don't necessarily always seem like they match what you were hoping.
Yeah, sure thing. So context very key, and also just challenging ourselves to look at the big picture, because like you say, workplace stress isn't necessarily, in fact in many cases isn't actually about work. It's the things that make up the person. Yeah. Okay. So I think everything we've just spoken about there presents a very strong moral argument for inclusion in the workplace, right, on a number of levels. But then on the flip side of that, it's also for some people a fundamental business case. And if we're talking about a business case, we need tangible data points that people can talk about in a boardroom and make decisions on, right, informed decisions on. And so off the back of that, what examples of best practice have you seen where actually investing in and focusing on inclusion has delivered a measurable boost in well-being and retention?
So I guess if we think that culture is the beating heart of the organisation, and sometimes you can't isolate some aspects of your culture, then it's, I think, difficult to necessarily peel back the layers without, in a very straightforward, we did this and it improved that.
Yeah.
But what we know is that things like employee resource groups make people feel as though they have a place to go, that people seeing themselves in senior leadership positions is really important. Believing that you have got opportunities to training, to development, to projects, to programs is really significant. Knowing that your personal circumstances are understood enough to be reflected in policy. So all the things that we talked about will be the things that add up. I guess what we have to do then is to understand in the round, what is it that people value? And so MHFA England, we did the Great Places to Work survey, which was your annual survey benchmarked against other organisations that were similar to you. But the thing which we did, which lots of groups, lots of organisations didn't do, was to ensure that we then got the data disaggregated, so that it was, so you would get your general score, so
Yes.
Staff engagement score was whatever, then you would get LGBTQ plus employees, black employees, people of colour, women, and people with disability.
Okay.
So you would then be able to see overall
What are the
what's your
trends?
score, and then are there any distinct differences between the groups? And sometimes there were, and sometimes there weren't. But even a small percentage would say, "Oh, that's interesting. Let's ask a question of that group of people able to follow through." Whether, I mean, MHFA England was obviously a small organisation, so we often knew each other very well, so might be able to ask questions on a informal basis, but equally on a formal basis. And yeah, what we know in bigger organisations is that if we can get the right data, which understands how we attract, recruit, retain, develop staff, then that will give you some really, really good information about whether what you're doing works for everybody or whether it works for some people and not others. And if it doesn't work for everybody, what do we need to do in order to be able to change that?
So, do you know what? That's a really good point about actually going the extra mile to kind of disaggregate that kind of top line data, because as you did there with Great Places to Work, if we're talking about best practice, in terms of establishing the real business case for focusing on and investing in inclusion, being able to establish any kind of underlying trends, any variance between one part of your workforce or another, I think it's so important. And the analogy I draw on here is like if you were a marketing department, you would call it knowing your customer. Well, I think it's the same with knowing your employee, their pain points, their values, what's going to help them thrive. Something else that came up in the report, and it's not verbatim, but it's something to the effect of, I guess, a bit of a barrier in terms of data collection. So we know the importance, but actually what stops companies from doing it in an effective way? And that was very specifically around the idea that LGBTQ plus employees not feeling psychologically safe to actually come forward and say, hey, this is part of my experience and I would like it represented on a company dashboard. And I guess the question is, where that might be the case, what guidance would you give to employers to kind of overcome and reassure their employees that actually this is a good thing to be involved with in terms of the data collection?
It's a really important point, and it is definitely something which we know that companies, big, small, global, domestic, across all sectors really do struggle with. I think the first thing is you clearly have to be able to describe to employees why you want the data and what will happen and where will the walls be around it, so that it doesn't impact on your experience negatively. If you think that backdrop of, is this going to impact on me negatively, is a really important one, which we have to know and understand. And so you might be the best employer in the world, but if the world outside is talking about data, there's all sorts of questions about data, how it will be used, and therefore you've got concerns, then those will manifest themselves in the company. So really being able to be clear about why you want it, that it is about improving experience, it is about becoming more inclusive, that there will be some walls around it so it won't impact on relationships with others, and it won't be used at a personal level, can be really, really important. We know some people talk about disclosing your personal information. I think that the word disclosing is a really interesting word, because that suggests that it's something that you need to disclose rather than something you're offering or something that you're asked to provide. So I'm not quite sure what the right word is.
It's almost disempowering, isn't it?
Well, it feels like you're disclosing something,
Yeah,
rather than you're
giving something
your
away.
experience.
Yeah. I guess from when I think about what works in terms of well-being initiatives, there's some parallels there, because ultimately if your employees think that an initiative has come kind of out of context, left of field, like let's say it came out of nowhere, there's no discernible benefit, and it's taking time out of what is already a busy schedule, there's a good chance the engagement won't be there either. And it sounds like it's quite similar in terms of presenting the case for data collection in a positive light.
All these things have to be a shared endeavour.
Yes.
That's the point. We have to know, we have to understand. And one of my strengths is simplifying things, as I was saying to you before we talked, it can go the other way sometimes. But I always think whenever you look at the evidence on most things, do people understand what you're doing? Do they understand why you're doing it? And do they understand what success looks like? And normally, in one way, shape or form, the evidence shows that where everybody involved does understand what they're doing, does understand the why, does understand the how, does understand the success, then you get the benefits because you get the buy-in, you get the collective endeavour on the way.
And so speaking of collective endeavour and buy-in, obviously we've just spoke about it from like an employee perspective in terms of offering up information about their experience. See, avoided the D word, eh? But so how does that look on the flip side in terms of managers? Because and the one final thing that I'm going to talk about from this report was that there's a lot of managers that actually avoid talking about inclusion through fear of saying the wrong thing or making mistakes. How do we get to a place where that isn't a barrier to conversations about inclusion?
Yeah. I mean, this is a whole nother podcast in itself, isn't it? That managers are often accidental. So I talked about my career being accidental. All of my management experience is accidental. And the Chartered Management Institute research shows time and time again that most managers become managers by accident. And so they get there without training, without support. And then even when you get the training and support, what you then often don't have is the time. Management takes time. It requires us to be in relationship together. It requires us to understand a bit about each other, to ask questions of each other, to understand what's going to help us to do our best, what the relationship looks like. If I've got to give you feedback, how would you like to go? Is it face-to-face? Do you want it written in advance so we can have the conversation? And if you want to feedback to me on my feedback, how do I want to receive it so I can hear? All of those things are really, really fundamentally important. And if you don't have that relationship, then you often will fear getting it wrong more than you would if you have a relationship. If you trust best intentions, even when we get it wrong, you can sort of tend to have that conversation and navigate through it. But if you believe it's a manager doing something because they've been told to and then they get it wrong, there's a little bit less forgiveness.
Yeah, no, I had a similar thought actually, just when I was kind of preparing these notes, and I thought to myself, actually, just personally, I don't know how it works for anybody else, but I would actually much rather, and I would feel a lot more comfortable if somebody was to, with the best intentions, get it wrong, but they were coming from the right place and they were willing to learn. And again, it was coming from the right place in terms of establishing that connection, building a rapport, and understanding another person's preferences and way of working, than actually just not saying anything. Half of nothing is nothing.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you mentioned something earlier about I guess just the kind of the climate that we're in as well. Quite polarized. A lot of concerns for different segments of the LGBTQ plus community, but not just the LGBTQ plus community, but allies and people from all walks of life, just in terms of what's going on politically and also with legislation as well. I guess the question off the back of that is, what is the most effective way for organizations to support LGBTQ plus employees when public discourse turns hostile?
I think it's to go back to the conversation that we were having earlier, which is about recognizing it, talking about it, understanding that it's happening, and then asking people if they're okay, but also recognizing that some people will want to talk, some people won't want to talk, some people want to talk to their manager, some people might want to talk to a mental health first aider or to the person in HR. So for me, it's about creating workplaces and workspaces in which people know that they are welcome to have conversations, that we understand the impact of the environment that we're operating in, and that we're able to have those conversations comfortably, and you can choose who they are. That it's not, you have to talk to Matt. That there are a range of people within that.
Okay, so we're thinking about psychological safety, understanding how different people like to work, offering people the choice. Yeah. Okay. There was one piece. I thought I had it written down here, so I'm gonna have to do it from memory. But there was one piece that I was drawn to in your your strategic priorities 2025 to 2028. I believe it was on page 6. Very specifically,
okay.
Right? And it will be familiar, but it's kind of the backstory to why I asked this question. We mentioned it already, but very specifically around public discourse turning hostile, because on page 6, there was an excerpt from an article, and it was talking about concerns for the current political climate. Potentially inciting, acceptance of hatred, and just talking really about where that might lead for the future. And, you kind of get to the end of it. I'm not going to try and remember it because I'll butcher it. But ultimately, you get to the end of it and it says, right, this was basically the thoughts and feelings and sentiments of 280 people from different walks of life on the eve or very, very near to a meeting in the House of Lords around the repeal of Section 28, circa 1989. But when you read it, you're thinking to yourself, actually, if I didn't see that piece, that could have been today. You would have fooled me. You would have fooled me. So yeah, I think really important that, like you say, you're thinking of things employers are thinking of things from a psychological safety point of view, giving people the choice, and again, just not avoiding the conversation, even with best intentions. Even if you're going to get it slightly wrong, that's better than not having the conversation at all. And you can clearly see that actually things are changing outside, and that is going to affect how people walk through those doors every day.
Yeah, well remembered, and you did a really good job. It was 280 people. I think that's why we included it. It was about actually, yes, there's been progress. Yes, there has been change, but let's not kid ourselves that we are anywhere near where we want to be when it comes to LGBTQ plus inclusion, and that it's so important for people to be able to speak up and to say, we will not stand by, we cannot stand by and let this kind of discrimination happen. And it's actually quite sad to read it and to think it could be written today. This could be you and I and 278 other people writing it in advance of things which are going through Parliament at this moment in time. And that's why, going right back to the bit at the beginning, what's the fire in my belly? It's because I don't want to wait another 40 years. I used to say, when I was at the Sex Education Forum, we cannot allow another generation of children, young people to grow up with the shame, fear, humiliation that so many of my generation did. And sadly, they are. Yes, there is change. Yes, there's progress, but not nearly enough.
So you mentioned about, obviously we're just talking about Parliament and legislation, the political climate. What shifts in policy or legislative agenda do you think would most improve mental health outcomes for LGBTQ plus employees?
So when we were at MHFA England, we were really clear that mental health really needs to have some legislative basis, that there's been lots and lots of carrot and that there's been some real progress around that, but that there needs to be some kind of framework which all employers are required to deliver on. And I still support that now as a baseline. In terms of what would improve LGBTQ plus employees' experience, all of the data, all of the information that we get goes back to the same things, a sense of belonging, creating that psychological safety, understanding the specific work context that they're operating in, and then understanding what you need to do. There is the blanket stuff, the leadership, the visibility, the connection, the sense of belonging.
Sure.
But that feels very different if you are working in one industry as opposed to another. So it's all the time really understanding that. And it's why, like in mental health, we've had some really positive collaboration, across businesses, because they know this isn't an area to be competing in. This is an area where we need to really keep making progress as quickly as possible.
Yeah, so just leading on from that collaboration piece, another part of your your Stonewall strategic priorities was about intersectionality and underrepresented voices. And obviously, when we're talking about intersectionality, it's a framework for understanding how multiple social categorizations combine to create unique experiences. And as I mentioned, aspects of people's identity don't exist in a vacuum. And in the strategy, it talks about, it stresses that actually in some cases this can amplify discrimination. So how can employers address mental health challenges that arise when LGBTQ plus identity intersects with other marginalized characteristics?
Yeah. I mean, it's that classic bit, isn't it? Yes, the politics of solidarity. So, as a community, the LGBTQ plus community is absolutely connected, but actually the lived experiences will be different depending on, your own personal experience. And I was at UK Black Pride last weekend before, in the last week or so. And, I always remember Phil, Lady Phil, who was one of the founders, talk about, being a woman, being lesbian, being black. They bring their own forms of marginalisation and discrimination and prejudice. and you put them together and they create a unique experience which will be uniquely mine, and it will be similar to other people's, and there will be similarities and differences all of the time. And so this is why, right back to your conversation about inclusion, it's about creating a culture. It isn't there are 5 rules here which everyone must follow, but what is the culture which signals to everybody that they're valued, that they belong, that they're seen as an individual, and recognizing that there might be those multiple layers of oppression which will impact on people's experiences, and that we want to find a way to navigate through that so that everybody feels like they're included.
Yeah. And would you say that there are any specific, let's say, we spoke, data points that help to shift the thinking of senior managers when it comes to this focus on inclusion?
So I think stories impact. I think lived experiences impact. So people's communities, and that we mustn't, in the search for numbers, we mustn't underestimate the power of that. And we've seen how storytelling can really influence change within organisations, both from the ground up, but also from the top down. But then there is also that data which is about people's experiences, and that sense of that might be progression, it might be the numbers of people that are coming through in the first instance. So depending on the type of business you are and the size of business and what your priorities are, but all the time, what's the business imperative, what's the human imperative, what's the moral imperative, and how do all of those 3 things come together to make a really strong and compelling case? Because businesses, of course, are about performance. They're about trying to succeed. And then you have businesses and charities and organisations which have social purpose. And increasingly, we expect all organisations to have some social responsibility. But collectively, if we only ever measure GDP, then we're only ever going to measure monetary value. And where you have countries like New Zealand that have looked at where does well-being come into that sense of overall well-being, we have to have different conversations then within businesses. So for me, it is all the time, what's the human case, what's the moral case, what's the business case, how do we bring all of those things together to make it a really compelling case for inclusion?
Yeah. So not everything of value has a pound sign next to it.
But what we measure, what's the phrase? Well, we value what we can measure,
Sure.
And we measure what we value.
Sure.
So it may not have a pound sign, but we've got to find ways to measure it.
And what gets measured gets improved.
Exactly.
Nice. Just thinking now about practical guidance for employers. So very specifically, if an organization could do just 3 things tomorrow to improve LGBTQ plus employees' mental health, what would they be? Specifically, if we're thinking about low cost, high impact actions.
Yeah. The first thing, and the thing that I will always go back to, is talk to your employees. That has to be the first one. The very act of talking to your staff is an act of engagement. It is an act of inclusion. It's signalling to people that you care. So we often forget that the process is as important as the outcome. So I would just have that as absolutely number one within it. The second thing would then be to be really, really clear that every time you're having a performance conversation, you're having a mental health conversation, and every time you're having a mental health conversation, you're having a performance conversation, and that is that link, that mental health, well-being, equity, performance link is absolutely critical. The Bunsen burners, so number 2, the Bunsen burner, and then number 3, make sure that there is time and energy put into this. That if we say that we're committed and then don't put some resource into it or give people the time to be able to do it, so it gets done badly, gets done on the side of the desk, it's almost worse than not being done at all, because it signals to people that actually there's a gap between what you say and what you think needs to happen. So the process of engagement is really important. Thinking about those 3 bits, that it's not an either or in relation to mental health, equity or performance, they all go together, and then make sure you resource. Better to do 1 or 2 things really, really well. And that sense of visibility, connection, creating that sense of belonging. Whatever it is, the people will tell you, your people will tell you the one or two things that make a difference. Do them really well and build from there.
Yeah, and I love that piece there. I mean, you're right about the simplicity thing. Better to do one or two things really well than a number of them badly or not at all, right? No, I love that. Thank you. And then just thinking now, I guess really looking to the future, right? Your current strategy takes us through to 2028. So the question off the back of that is, in terms of what are your hopes or aspirations for what the workplace will look like for LGBTQ plus employees by 2030?
The obvious answer to that is that I want everybody who's LGBTQ plus to feel as though they belong at work, and I absolutely do. But more than that, what I really want is for workplaces to understand, employers to think about the added value that having people with diverse lived experiences, diverse viewpoints, diverse perspectives on the world can bring into the culture of the organisation, the creativity of the organisation, the innovation, and therefore the business performance. And wider than that, if we get inclusion in the workplace right and people feel good in the workplace, that impacts on positively on wider society. And when you get that sort of virtuous circle where people feel good at work, feel good in the community, and then feel better at work. So work is fundamental to societal change.
Amazing. Simon, it's been an absolute pleasure sitting down, talking things through. Thanks for your time.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
Cheers. This has been Wellbeing Talk with myself, Matt Balfour, your guide to more accessible conversations about mental health in the workplace. Be sure to subscribe to the Let's Go Wellbeing YouTube channel, and we'll connect on the next episode.